Okay, great. So thank you guys so much for taking the time to come out for our Farming for Carbon and Nature biodiversity monitoring training. Um, we are going to be just going over what Farming for Carbon and Nature is, answering any questions that you have, and discussing a lot of the context around what we do and why we do it. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you can please make sure to keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking. Please keep your camera on if you feel comfortable, and feel free to ask any questions in the chat. If you have any questions that might be a little bit more complex, feel free to raise your hand and we will address them as quickly as possible. So just to introduce ourselves, so Odette, who is not here today, she is the Senior Project Manager for Farming for Carbon and Nature. You have probably been in touch with her quite consistently over the last couple of months. I am Jacqueline Adelson, and this is my colleague Katie. So we are project managers and project assistants at SOS UK. And so, yeah, what we're going to be covering today is an introduction to SOS, climate, nature, and farming, an introduction to Farming for Carbon and Nature. We'll be then taking a brief break, if that's something that we would like to do, before moving on to biodiversity monitoring, survey methods, and training feedback. I think just considering the nature of the group size, we can assess breaks and whether or not we need them at the time. So by the end of this training, we want to make sure that you can describe the aims of SOS UK and our farming pilot project. We want to outline how farming in the UK can positively impact the climate crisis. We want to outline how farming in the UK can have a positive impact on nature restoration and supporting biodiversity. We would also like you to define the purpose of the biodiversity monitoring scheme within Farming for Carbon and Nature pilot projects, and how we're going to carry out these biodiversity monitoring activities, including how you will describe your data. So you might be wondering, who are we? What do we do at SOS UK? So we are a climate education charity that launched in October of 2019, and our objective is to engage, inspire, and empower students to learn, act, and lead for environmental justice. We really strongly believe in lifelong learning, and we want to support students who live in halls or live out of halls to be able to make really important impacts and decisions in their lives, especially as they're transitioning into new chapters of what they're doing. So we have all sorts of different projects that cover students who live in halls to staff at different institutions, to how institutions are investing their money. We really want to have a very, very comprehensive approach towards how we engage and educate on the climate crisis, including with secondary and post students as well. So I'm sure that you have heard the phrase climate and nature emergency before. So let's talk about how farming can help. Based on data, based on 2030 government targets, there is a 95% probability of exceeding 1.5 degrees. Just as of today, which is Wednesday, May 8th, for those of you who are watching on YouTube, there have been a lot of new studies published saying literally today that we are probably going to pass that. So we cannot just rely on government action at the moment. A nationally determined contribution, or an NDC, is a climate action plan to cut emissions and adapt to climate impacts. So each party to the Paris Agreement is required to establish these NDCs and update them every 5 years. So we really want to make sure that not only are we lobbying with our governments, we're working with our institutions and really doing everything that we can to help mitigate the climate crisis. As temperatures rise, so do additional impacts and risks from climate change. This was highlighted by a recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which concluded that impacts and risks are significantly higher at 2 degrees compared to 1.5. The world scientists confirmed in 2018 and 2021 that at the current rate, we can cross 1.5 degrees as soon as 2030, possibly sooner. So the graphic that you see shows additional risks and impacts due to climate change up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And so we're currently at 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So you can see in the white part, so on the left side of the screen, that no impacts are detectable if we stay at pre-industrial levels. Yellow is that impacts and risks are becoming detectable, so that's at 0.5 degrees increased. And these can be attributed to climate change with at least medium confidence. So when we're seeing things like coral reefs starting to bleach, that could in theory happen without climate change, but it is likely that climate change is contributing in some way. When we're looking at red, so this is when we're approaching the 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and that's where we're at right now. We're having some severe and widespread impacts and risks. So you might be thinking of the wildfires that we saw in Europe last summer, or in Canada, where I'm from, so obviously quite important to me. Or some of the more extreme weather events that we have been seeing across the global south and also in the global north, but due to a lot of big socio-political inputs, we're also really starting to see the impact in these kinds of communities. So when we're looking at purple, so this is 1.5 degrees and above, we are seeing some very high risks of severe impacts in the presence of irreversible issues related to climate change that are 100%, we cannot deny they are related to climate change. So if you look at this graph here, coral reefs are obviously at an increased risk. The Arctic region, it's warming faster than the rest of the world, or at least at a faster rate. And we're also seeing coastal flooding issues with rivers and heat-related diseases and death. When we're thinking of what climate change actually is, it's not just temperatures are getting warmer and weather is getting more unpredictable. It's also how that's going to impact our livelihoods and our health, if we're not able to access stable and secure food sources, as one example. So moving on. So as part of the climate crisis, we are also experiencing a biodiversity crisis. So this is the rapid loss of species and the rapid degradation of our ecosystems, which house our species. You might see it referred to as the nature crisis, ecological crisis, but realistically, they all do mean very similar things. The UN Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services estimate around 1 million animal and plant species are at risk of extinction. We are currently losing species at around 100 to 1,000 times faster than the natural extinction rate. And that's why we're also considered to be in an Anthropocene-related extinction, or I believe the fifth mass extinction. The percent of species at risk is only an estimate, and it's expected to increase to over 50% by the end of the century. And this is a rate of approximately 10,000 times higher than the average historical extinction rates. So some groups seen in this chart are particularly at risk, such as amphibians. So this is due to reliance on freshwater habitats and moistures on specific microclimates. Conifers, which you can see as 34%, are also reliant on really specific soil types, and colder climates, which are increasingly at risk, and including with forest fires. Reef corals and sharks and other kinds of aquatic creatures are all at higher risks too, especially as the ocean is warming much faster than other parts, and that is resulting in higher acidity, which in turn wipes out many organisms like reefs, which bleach and have really severe impacts with algae production as well. So there is a goal to increase the percentage of protected areas to 30% by 2030 to tackle this climate crisis, which we really, really hope comes to fruition. And if we can get our agriculture involved in that, then that is a really important thing that we need to be focusing on. So you might be thinking, why are we talking about this? Why does it matter? So obviously, nature is quite important. We need to meet our basic human needs. We need healthy agricultural soils for food production. We need genetic diversity for future food crops. Because especially if you're only planting the same crop over and over and over again, that just starts to degrade the soil at a certain point because the soil is lacking in nutrients. We need to make sure that we have sufficient resources for medicine and other medical inputs, and we need to make sure that our ecosystem services are regulated by the climate. So this includes services such as pollination, seed dispersal, climate regulation, water purification, nutrient cycling, and control of agricultural pests. The environmental economist Pavan Sukhdev estimates that the cost of the world of not preserving our ecosystems and biodiversity could be between 1.2 and 2.8 trillion every single year. This is why it is so imperative to be acting now, and why it's really incredible that there are so many people in this chat, or maybe watching later, that are interested in helping us achieve that goal. Biodiversity also has a lot of cultural value for the life around us. Pardon me, or for spiritual value. A lot of people derive value from biodiversity through leisure, such as a walk or a hike or bird watching. It inspires our art. It's not just a physical thing, it's also how we interpret the world around us. Agriculture has obviously quite a big impact on the climate and biodiversity crisis, but UK statistics are not reflective of global statistics. So globally, as you can see from this slide, 50% of our planet's habitable land is farmed. So global food and farming is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, water use, and soil degradation. There are a lot of really popular, BBC Earth documentaries, which will actually show how, palm oil plantations are a really major driver of biodiversity and habitat loss, for example, in Brazil, or how the farms that we have in the UK are taking away land from possible predators that might be being reintroduced. And those are just two examples. So agriculture is responsible for 34% of global emissions. We do need to eat. That's not for debate. But how we actually make that happen is what we need to work on. However, in the UK, we live in a very fertile and flat country. So 70% of the UK is farmed. That means that 70% of our land is used for farming. That is huge. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and wildlife has declined by 69% since agricultural intensification 50 years ago. In the UK alone, this is responsible for 10% of our emissions. So as you can see, this is really important to get tackled or to tackle so we can understand how to work with our food systems, with our farmers, and really just work together, because that is the purpose of what this is. No one is here to convince anybody that farming is bad and that agriculture isn't important, but making sure that it's green and environmentally friendly is imperative to the health and success of our planet. Farming can cool the planet through all sorts of different inputs, like I keep saying. So in collaboration with Flame and the National Federation of Young Farmers, we run projects that bring together students, young farmers, and food and land justice advocates and activists. The following 3 slides are infographics put together to explain why farming is so important if you care about sustainability. So we can see this one, why it's talking about how working with landscapes can restore ecosystems, by improving soil quality can improve ecosystems. We can all work together for regenerative agriculture. That is a really important one, where when I was talking before about constantly planting the same crops over and over, that's not very regenerative. We want to make sure that everybody has the ability to keep planting crops that keep our soil healthy. So farming for carbon and nature. So we are working with 10 farms at universities and colleges across the UK. So in the UK alone, 35,000 hectares of fertile soil and farmland are on university campuses that get rented out again, which are called tenant farms. So we want to be working to help universities and farmers together reduce those emissions and get to net zero, as quite a lot of individual universities, individual farmers have embedded into their policies. So we want to support farmers to learn from each other and learn from experts about farming for better soil health, farming to reduce GHG emissions, and farming to help nature and support recovery and increase biodiversity. We really want to get more students on the farms learning about nature, climate, and farming. We want to collect and analyze soil and biodiversity data so we can help actually say, we know that there are X amount of species on this farm. We know that we have to do X, Y, and Z to support them and actually put those plans into place. We want to encourage universities and colleges to support farms on their land to adopt these practices. And this is all through the Farming for Carbon and Nature pilot program. And so we really look forward to this being officially launched in 2025. So as you can see here, this is just an infographic on what I was saying before. So this is a map of our current Farming for Carbon and Nature farms. So as you can see, they are spread all across England. And we really want to, again, be just working the best that we can to support those whose livelihoods are farming and to support the universities that they are on. So do we have any questions about all of the many, many things that I just spoke about? Oh, Matt?
Did you, this year, have you managed to get the other universities to sort of carry on the journey, I suppose?
As in terms of universities who have done this project before?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Obviously, it's been going for a couple of years, hasn't it? Well,
Yeah, we have a lot.
2021.
Do have a lot of returning universities this year. Yeah, and we
Yeah.
were able to use their data from last year, and we're looking forward to just comparing all of the great stuff that our student volunteers are able to help us collect.
Yeah, so you can sort of follow
Yeah,
changes potentially from one year to the next.
exactly. And which is really great, and that's the kind of thing that we are really enthusiastic about. Are there any other questions before we move on?
No, that's great.
Fabulous. So we have the option for a break right now. How do you guys feel about that? We can just keep going if you would prefer.
Yeah, happy to carry on.
Sweet, let's keep it up.
Yeah.
So Katie, I believe this is for you now.
Yeah, this is my part. You might want a break after this, but
Yeah, right.
I'm also going to turn my camera off because I feel like sometimes when I'm trying to talk and my Wi-Fi goes down, you may not be able to hear me. So that's my part. So I'm going to be talking about biodiversity monitoring data. So the first bit that I've got is with our farming for carbon and nature biodiversity days, we tend to complete the ones that are here. So in March and April, typically we have earthworm counts and we have the big farmland bird count. So I'm just going to explain that a little bit. So the big farmland bird count is an annual event that encourages farmers and land managers to report the bird species and numbers on their farms. We also complete the mammal map with the Mammal Society, so it's all about recording a one-off sighting, and we tend to use an app, so we report that sighting on the home screen, for instance, and then we select surveys, and then we can, dependent on the records selected, the app will take you through what you need to record and what you don't. In May and June, which is kind of now, we have the Great British Hedgerow Survey, which is, well, to be fair, it has two main aims. So the first aim is that the survey provides a health check to assess the conditions of each of the hedgerows surveyed. So the results offer instant feedback and tailored management advice for each hedge to ensure the hedge thrives for the benefit of wildlife in our future. But to collect this data, we collect it to get a national view of the conditions of our hedgerows and to understand the conditions of hedges and give us the best chance of helping to restore them. And then we also typically tend to complete flying insects or a fit count, which is something that I'll go on a little bit more depth into later on. But to understand why your data will be important is part of a national database, so helping to understand where species are not present and the quality of habitats. That's typically why we tend to complete them. But yeah, any questions on that section? I'm not too sure exactly what we're clicking through. Again. So that was my little quick section. So the next section I'm talking about is farming for carbon and nature, so pollinators. I believe we might have clicked a little bit too fast through. Click through again, sorry about this. One more. Oh, I'm in the host now.
I thought that I was doing something that made a lot more sense than that actually was. Just give me 1 second.
Sorry about this.
Sorry, Katie, I've made you the host. If you don't mind just making me the host again.
Making you the host again.
Yeah. I promise I am actually a professional at what I do.
Why is that? We should be up to pollinator surveys.
Sorry about that, guys.
So if we click through
forwards or back?
Forwards. So up to farm carbon nature pollinator surveys. Oh, I don't have this part.
I'm gonna just pause.
Oh.
There we go.
So the importance of pollinators to food and farming. So pollinating insects actually play a vital role in our environment and human survival. For example, we have pollinators to thank for a third of every mouth that we feed. And so not only do they pollinate our food crops, but they're also vital for the survival of other wild plants that support much of our wildlife. So 1/3 of all food we eat requires pollination. We've got some other little funky statistics on here. But in general, more than 75% of leading global crop types benefit from animal pollination, production, yield, and quantity. So we've got 35%, for instance, here in the corner of global agricultural land is benefited by pollinators. So pretty big. But it's not just about honeybees. If we're on to the next slide. Insect pollinators are an incredibly diverse group. So most of us tend to think of bees in relation to pollination, yet insect pollinators are an incredibly diverse group, as it says on the slide. Honeybees are mostly kept in managed hives and are likely to be responsible for pollinating between 5 to 15% of the UK's insect pollinated crops. So that leaves about 85 to 95% of the UK's insect pollinated crops relying heavily on wild pollinators. So many species of bees, moths, butterflies, flies are providing essential service in the UK and globally. So they pollinate about £690 million worth of crops annually, which is huge. So taking over this job ourselves would be difficult, definitely, and time consuming, and it would cost us an estimated 1.8 billion every year, so quite a difference. But there are lots of threats to these, and pollinating insects need our help. So human activities threaten pollinators. Both the abundance, diversity and health of pollinators are threatened, as well as the provision of pollination. So in recent decades, climate change has altered the range, abundance and season activities of some wild pollinator species. So humans have altered the natural landscape and changed the land use. So we've actually reduced the number of natural habitats of wild pollinator species, but simultaneously at the same time, environmental pollution has degraded the natural habitats. So habitat destruction, fragmentation, degradation, all of those often reduce pollinators' food and nesting resources. But forms of agriculture have actually kind of changed and influenced pollinators with a large shift and a kind of focus on artificial forms of pollination in recent years. So intensive agriculture and the management is a leading threat to pollinator species. So controlled forms of pollination by managed pollinators have brought in risks. So mass breeding and large-scale transport of managed bees contributed to an enhanced transmission of parasites and pathogens. So this actually then spread disease across the entire community of both wild and managed pollinators. But also additionally, it increased the occurrence of more dangerous pathogens. So there were often invasions and invasive species and a regional extinction of some kind of native species. So yeah, that wasn't too good. But the next section is about our ponds, which I mentioned I'd be going on about a little bit earlier. So I can give you a bit of an overview into that, and you'll see that on the slide in a minute. So our ponds, if Jacqueline gets to the slide, lovely, is the first scheme in the world to kind of generate systematic data on the abundance of bees, hoverflies and other flower visiting insects at a national scale. We know that pollinators are vital to ensuring that many of our crops and wild plants are able to self-seed and produce fruit. But yeah, we need to know how these pollinator populations are changing, and we gather this by data on flower visiting insects, and that's what a POM fit count is. So a POM's kind of fit count, as it stands for, is the main way to help collect data in the months of April to September. So this survey method asks you to count every insect that lands on a flower in a chosen area or a chosen target within a 10-minute period. So you can complete a fit count, typically in good weather, between, as I mentioned, April to September. As it says on the screen, in a minute. Good weather is typically dry, with the temperature at least 13 degrees in sunny conditions, and you can carry out multiple counts in one location, which is good. I have actually, on the slides to come, included here we go, a little overview. You can watch this video. Perfect, I'll mute myself and hopefully the sound should go. There we go.
Used to pollinate our crops and produce honey. But we actually have over 250 species of native bee here in the UK, as well as other pollinators such as butterflies, beetles and flies. And I think these are often a little neglected. So if you'd like to help our pollinators, the UK's pollinator monitoring scheme is asking us all to participate in their citizen science project, monitoring the pollinating insects in our green spaces. And this uses their fit count method, which stands for flower insect time count. It's quite simple. Firstly, we need some good weather above 13 degrees Celsius between the months of April to September. Then find a nice flowery patch like this and mark out a 50 by 50 centimeter square. I've used string, but you could also use something like sticks. Choose just one type of flower to focus on, ideally one of the fit count target species such as knapweed, but you could also use something like dandelion, bramble, or even thistledew. Then start your timer and spend 10 minutes counting all of the insects that land on your target flower in your square. We want to ignore all the other flower species and only try and count each insect once. 10 minutes seems like a long time, but it really does fly by. If possible, try to identify insects into broad groups such as bumblebees and hoverflies. If you're not sure, just label them as other insects. Then submit your data to the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme's website or use their dedicated Fit Count phone app. It has all the information you would need, as well as help identifying the different insect groups. So you might be thinking, why all the buzz around pollinators? Well, they are essential to maintaining a balanced ecosystem, and sadly, many of them are in decline. So why not join the Royal Park's mission invertebrate by planting wildflowers in your gardens and by conducting your very own fit count? Our pollinators will surely be grateful that you rose to the challenge.
I think we can agree that's probably a explanation than my one. So as they spoke in the video, they said some of the equipment that you'll need, well, they said an area by 50 centimeter area. So for this, the equipment that we'll typically use is a quadrat. So as it states on the slide, one per pair, it can be made with wood, tape, string, however you want to make a quadrat. We also provide, or want to provide, a POMS fit count recording sheet. There are also quite a few apps that you can have installed which do the same. But if you are going to use the app for the fit count, you need to make sure you create an account, and then just the usual pen, pencil, pollinated insect guide, your ID guides, anything that you're going to be able to identify what's flying in. So on the next slide, I have got a little bit of like a key almost to what to do before. So before the day, you typically tend to familiarise yourself with the species groups. And so if we click through, the categories that you'll be recording are typically, let's just click through. Here we go, all of these. So bumblebees, honeybees, solitary bees, wasps, hoverflies, other flies, butterflies, moths, etc. And in some slides to come, we'll be able to see the difference between a few of these. But another thing, and I'm going to go through some steps as to, and it did stay in the video, but we can just fly through these. So step one is to check the air temperature. So we want to check the temperature at the beginning of the survey. It needs to be a minimum of about 13 degrees in sunny conditions, or 15 degrees when it's cloudy. Step two is to work as a group with your tutor to mark out the quadrat location, remember 50 by 50, and assign them to student pairs. So we've got our transect, our perimeter transect, and that's just typically for different types of land and pastures, so permanent pastures and then also arable crops. We then typically tend to identify a patch or target close to a sample point. So there is a list of suggested flowers that we typically tend to monitor between April and June. For instance, as we've got some pictures actually of the slide. So April onwards tend to be your dandelions, your buttercups, your hawthorns, but in May and June time, so now onwards, there's a bramble on the screen, so that's for sure. We've got lavenders, kind of hogweeds, white clovers. I don't think we've got any more on that slide. And then you place your quadrat on that patch you've chosen. And then, as mentioned before, the recorder method, which I spoke about a minute ago. So if you're using your POMS fit count on your app, you need to make sure you've downloaded it. And then if you're using a paper recording sheet, for instance, I've actually got some slides coming up with the instructions of how to do that. So if that is your chosen way of recording, we have put some little steps here. So you would fill in the details about your chosen patch. So as you can see on the screen, you've got your date of count, your location name, your grid reference. Typically, a lot of people tend to use a kind of OS grid reference app to get their grid reference of their location. And then if you know the type of habitat, great to cross it off. And then the next step is, again, the same as before, but to lay your quadrat over your chosen flowers and then fill in the details within that quadrat on the recording sheet. So we've got here is the target flowers less than half of the patch, are they about half, and then are they more than half? And then we'll have a look at the types of flowers in that patch. I believe on the screen and on that sheet it should say about individual flowers and flower heads, and you can tick through them. And then, as with any of the fit counts, you'd spend about 10 minutes recording pollinators that visit your quadrat. So you set a timer for about 10 minutes and you count all the insects that land on that chosen target flower. So that flower that you've decided to focus on between the months of May to June and April onwards. And then you look through and you can look at your insect group, and then you tally how many go into that. So your bumblebees, your wasps, etc. And then you would record the weather and take a photo of your target flower species. So with our weather conditions, as the sheet actually says, but on the app it'll be a little bit different. So the sky above your location, is it all or mostly blue? Is it half blue or half cloud? All or mostly cloud? So obviously on here it's got quite exact closed boxes, but I think on the app it's a little bit different. And then you would monitor and write down what it was like during that 10 minutes. So was it entirely sunshine? Was it partly in sun and partly shaded? Was it shaded, etc.? And they ask about wind strength, because that is quite important when you're focusing on one target species. And then we would repeat a second quadrat site just to see if it's very typical of what's happening. And it's always good to repeat an experiment. So if you are still using your paper recording sheet, step 9 would be to upload your records. So back in the classroom or wherever you are, it would be good to upload that to the POMS website. It's good to upload these things because then you can see what's happening like on a larger scale, not just within your little field. And then we've got a link on the slide, but we can always forward it on another point. So you can do a POMS fit count anywhere. So yeah, I would definitely recommend taking part to help with those. Just wonder if there's any questions at this moment in time, and if you still would like a break.
Yeah, no, that's it. I forgot that that's it. You've got to you're better to do the sheet and then upload it. I used the app. I think we mostly used the app last year, you see, which is really handy because literally you just click on the solitary bees, honeybees, or whatever. Yeah,
the apps are really good. We've got some in my kind of department, we've got some schools that are working with using the app, and for them it's so much easier and you don't lose the sheets of paper, because as we wrote on that slide, do it straight away because you definitely will put that down somewhere and not remember where it is.
Do you suggest doing the paper and the app?
Either or, to be honest. I think they are fairly similar, so it's not too bad. I think it just depends on where your space is and who's along. Like I said, sometimes with schools it's well, you can do it with any group, but currently on one of the projects that I'm working with, they're doing surveys, and we work with primary, secondary schools, and so sometimes it's just a case of which works better for them. Sometimes it's nice to see like smaller kids walking around with a piece of paper and doing it themselves, but equally so either or.
Yeah, the students tend to prefer just the app, but then you've got to make sure, don't you, that we put in it's logged as farming for carbon and nature. That's right. Just so that then for your records, when someone analyzes it, there's a trail. Isn't that right?
I'm not too sure about that, but I could find out. I haven't done the POMS for. I'm not sure if Jacqueline, you know that question.
Unfortunately not, no.
Okay, we can always find out.
I'm sure it's easy. It'll be easy, yeah.
Yeah. No, the app is definitely good, just as the same for a piece of paper, so it's not too bad.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Perfect. Yes. So did we want a break, or did we want to go through and kind of differentiate between some species groups? It won't be too long.
Yeah, carry on. I'm happy.
Okay, perfect. Right. So the next part.
I'm loving the enthusiasm from you both at the moment. Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right,
So,
carry on, Katie.
Lovely. So the next part that I am going to be going through will be differentiating different species groups. I know that I mentioned a minute ago Lovely, here we go. So I mentioned a bit earlier that we definitely go through these and try and kind of see the difference, because when you're completing a fit count, for instance, sometimes you might mistake something a little bit. So here we go. So a common one is bees versus wasps. So actually, as this slide demonstrates, and I think I'll talk through the slides because we've got some lovely little kind of points on these slides. So most bees are actually more hairy than wasps, and their wings are held quite flat, and that female bees have a pollen basket, so usually on their hind legs or under their abdomen, as you can see in this photo on the left, whereas with a wasp, as this photo shows, and it's actually a social wasp, I believe, at rest, wings are rolled up, so they're not like the held flat wings of the bees, and less obviously the hair, and often they have contrasting colours, so you can see that bees have that kind of hair a lot more than wasps don't. And our next one is kind of going a little bit more into them. So we've got bees and wasps on a smaller scale. So we've got a small solitary bee on the left, and then a solitary wasp on the right. That's your right, yes. So some obvious hairs on the bee are visible, and female bees have a pollen basket, so it's usually on their hind legs again, just under the abdomen, and often, and not always, they have at least a hint of stripes on the abdomen, whereas our solitary wasp, the head is often a lot bulkier and more rectangular than the bees, and there's no obvious hairs or pollen basket, and you can see that quite clearly a little bit on the photos if you just have a look in, that you can definitely see that the bees have those kind of hairs, you can see them, but yeah, the wasp doesn't as much. So we also, going through, can recognise the difference between honeybees and your kind of bumblebee. So for a honeybee, they are very long and narrow, and they have this kind of marginal cell about them, and their eyes are actually hairy, and so it's hard to see on the field, and they're very broad, and they also have their abdomen as colours that vary from fairly bright orange stripes all along to nearly black, and their pollen, where they hold it, is moistened and collected in the basket, and their antennae may be elbowed. Whereas if we go through, and I believe the next one is our bumblebees. Yes, here we are. Our bumblebees, they are quite different to the kind of honeybees. So your bumblebees are very like fluffy, if that's the term we can describe them with. So they're very fluffy. They're very kind of rounded in shape. They tend to have like very simple kind of contrasting colour bands. So you've got your kind of yellow, but a dull yellowish to your blacks. And the queens are larger than nearly all the solitary species. So if you see a big one, that's definitely a queen bee. And the bee's antennae are kind of angled or elbowed. So yeah, whereas as we've got in the corner, your solitary bee, and from the slides before, they're usually kind of hairy, but then they're not as kind of rounded as our bumblebee. And their colour contrasts are a lot harder to see, so you don't see the stripes that you've got in your bumblebee at the left, so it's very defined, whereas our kind of solitary bees and even our honeybees is not as much. And then on the next slide going on, we've got our wasps. So they're very different to a bumblebee. So their antennae are long with kind of many small, and this is a variety of wasps, so this is our wasp. So females may have a very kind of obvious kind of point at the tip of their abdomen. Their antennae are long with many small segments, and their overall shape is very long and narrow. It's not like our bumblebees, it's not like our other wasps that are quite rounded. They are quite long and quite thin as well. So on the next slide, as we go through, we've got some more wasps, but not just a wasp, we've also got a sawfly. So on our left, we've got a sawfly. So there's no kind of wasp waist. If you look at both the photos, the wasp kind of comes in a little bit narrow. our sawfly doesn't have that. It's not hairy, it's not got a pollen basket, and if you do see them flying in, the same with the pollens kind of fit count, they'll usually be a lot slower moving, where your kind of wasps will move in quite a lot faster than your sawfly. And then we've got something completely different in total, which is our hoverflies. So as the slide says, recognizing hoverflies. So hoverflies are usually quite shiny or reflective. They have a kind of black or yellow kind of undermarkings of their body. Their antennae are quite short, and I believe they move a lot faster as well, but I don't think that's on the slide. And then we've got some other flies coming up in a minute on the side, and this is just some other type of flies that you might see on your kind of ponds fit count. So we've got a dance fly up in the top, we've got a soldier fly at the bottom, we've got some yellow dung flies, we've got a green bottle fly, which I think is the most common that we tend to see a lot of. If we look through those photos, you've probably seen that one the most. It's one of our more common ones. So yeah, and then we've got some other smaller insects, which is on a slide coming up. Yeah, here we go. So in terms of smaller insects, these are typically tend to be like 3 millimeters or less in kind of length. So they occur mainly on flowers, including pollen bees, which can be abundant. So we've got, in one of them, we've got the aphid, we've got some parasitic wasps, and in the corner, which is kind of enlarged in, we've got a small solitary bee. So bees are all bigger than about 3 millimeters, but this one has kind of one on its hind legs, so it's quite a lot smaller. And then moving on, I believe we've got just a few more to go through. We've got beetles versus true bugs. So these do look quite different up close, but from away it might be hard to. So a beetle tend to have kind of hard wing cases. They're often shiny. They've got a straight line down the middle of the insect with a beetle. Whereas your kind of bugs, and this one is a shield bug, wings are part hard or leathery. It kind of forms an X on the back as opposed to beetle, which has got your long straight line. And in the fit count, we would put the kind of a shield bug as like an other categories, because people tend to have categories. So we'd put the beetle in the beetle category, and then your kind of shield bug would be in the other. And then we're moving on to butterflies and moths. So there's a lot of, and I'm not sure if any of you have had a debate between butterflies and moths, whether there should be any differentiation between them now, but butterflies and moths are both included in kind of the group of Lepidoptera, which means scale wing, referring to the kind of mosaic of tiny scales that make up fantastic colours and patterns. Yeah, as it says on this slide, both are actually kind of in the same grouping, so there's no need to differentiate between butterflies or moths. There's a lot of debates at the minute on whether there should be a differentiation at all, but for this we have some. So butterflies, we've got, so moths traditionally have been divided into kind of larger macro moths groups, and as we can see from these photos here, caterpillars are often seen on flowers, but they're not thought to play kind of a significant role in pollination. But yeah, it's just some photos of butterflies and moths. Not a large differentiation, but definitely in terms of colours and whatnot. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of some of the kind of species and flying insects that you might see on these ponds and fit counts and how to differentiate between them. But we can definitely send these slides through, or those watching on YouTube can pause it. So yeah, as we move through the slides, I think we've got some special thanks to give to those that have kind of contributed to the monitoring surveys, and we've got a thanks to Northumbria University. We also would like to thank the Biological Reporting Company, the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, not species, who actually provided some of the resources, and the Biological Records Centre, which have helped to upload and for management. So yeah, much thanks to them. And we've also got some further reading resources if anyone wants to go a little bit more into kind of learning a little bit more about our flying insects and our pollinators. So the Wildlife Trust have a good little link to saving bees and pollinators, the importance of pollinators to agriculture. There's loads that you can find online in terms of resources, but we've just put a few on. So yeah, thank you. I think Jacqueline's going to play us a video now. I don't think it's playing.
Katie has just been kind enough to let me know that there was no sound there. So sorry about that. And thank you so much for bearing with our many, many technical difficulties this afternoon. I think what might be just the easiest for everyone's schedules, I'm going to just stop sharing or stop recording